officials and researchers have demonstrated that even if Europe would still like to prefer it to be otherwise, the geopolitical climate will not allow it to stand on the sidelines of the changing realities. Europe is right in the middle of all of this, and the broad notion of neutrality seems no longer an option. In this broad rethink of Europe's role in the world, the notion of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty not only means that Europe needs to do its homework and up its game when it comes to industrial competitiveness, technological innovation, and more ambitious connectivity policy, it also means that Europe has to rethink its network of global partnerships. At the heart of this rethink is the Indo-Pacific region. And the fact that this morning we have about 120 people already joining us here underlines that the interest in the topic is quite substantial. The Indo-Pacific is currently the most dynamic growth region with huge potential and future markets, but it's also the region in which the success of climate policies will be decisive for the fight against global warming, and a region of multiple security hotspots and growing tensions between regional players with an increasingly assertive China and emerging great power competition from maritime security to cybersecurity. On the way to kind of recalibrate its relations in the region, in Europe's Indo-Pacific awakening, if we want to call it like that, we here at ECFR are engaging in an effort to map out European positions on the region and the key topics that it brings with it. Germany, France, and the Netherlands have already moved forward with strategy documents. The EU will follow suit shortly. But what is needed is obviously not just a piece of paper with carefully crafted words. That's what we're really good at the EU. What we really need is a strategic approach to the region that will be of utmost importance for Europe's future. We at ECFR throw ourselves behind this agenda to raise awareness within Europe for the need to rethink the Indo-Pacific region and our relationships with key allies and partners there. And over the coming months, we will not only engage in strategy group conversations, but also work on an Indo-Pacific scorecard detailing country preferences and priorities. So watch this space, there's much more to come. Today, we would like to kick off our activities with the conversation that asks a very diverse set of speakers to map out their expectations vis-à-vis Europe. We are delighted to welcome such a stellar lineup, which our moderator, my brand new colleague and Europe's Indo-Pacific genius, Frederic Grare, will introduce to you in detail when he takes over the moderation in just a minute. But allow me to already thank Mihoko Matsubara, Romana Vlahutin, Vijay Gokhale, and Flake for taking time out of what I know are very, very busy schedules to be with us today. Thank you all again for joining, and all of those at ECFR who made this possible through their relentless efforts. And with this, I would like to hand the floor over to Frederic, who will lead our discussion. Frederic, over to you.
Thank you, Janka, and a warm welcome to our guest and to the audience, which, as you said, is very substantial today. We do have the privilege, as you said, too, to have an exceptional panel of personality, part of whom form the region itself from the Indo-Pacific, and do represent at the same time a quite wide range of professional sectors, from diplomacy to academia to the private sector, with all of you having some experience in several of these fields anyway. To start with, we have Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who is the former Foreign Secretary of India and also a former Indian ambassador to China. We have Professor Gordon Flake, who is the founding CEO, of the Perth USAsia Center in Australia and an expert on key strategic relationship in the Indo-Pacific. We have Mrs. Mihoko Matsubara, who is the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation and also worked at the Defense Ministry for a long time. And we do have Ambassador Vlahutin, who is the current Ambassador at Large for Connectivity in the European External Action Service. So to each of them, we have asked to present their views on what they see the EU should do, what they consider the EU should do in the Indo-Pacific, and their views on the forthcoming strategy. And to Ambassador Vlahutin, of course, who sees things from a different perspective, we have asked to react to this expectation and present us also the way the EU thinks about the Indo-Pacific. So let's start immediately. Time is limited. Ambassador Gokhale, if I may start with you. What are India's expectations from Europe in the Indo-Pacific? And how does Europe fit in India's vision of the region?
Thank you, Frederic, and hello to everybody from India. Let me begin by saying, Frederic, that Indian foreign policy is undergoing a fundamental strategic adjustment. India is turning towards the oceans, and this is primarily driven by domestic interest, by the economy, but there are external factors, in particular, the rise of China. Now, I want to make 2 points for our European audiences to set the context. Firstly, after 2 centuries, the Indian Ocean, the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, is once again becoming a center of economic activity. And therefore, Europe's future is tied to it. It doesn't matter if you're landlocked or seafaring, if you're a big country in Europe or a small country in Europe, Europe's prosperity as a whole is going to be tied to the Indo-Pacific, including the Indian Ocean. That's the first point. The second point is that the period when the United States was the security guarantor, the sole security guarantor in the Indian Ocean, is coming to an end. The expansion of Chinese naval power is such that it will change the balance in the Indian Ocean. We don't know exactly how it will do so, but I think the European Union also, therefore, needs to pay attention to the security situation in the Indo-Pacific, quite apart from the economic and commercial situation. Now, it is in this context that Prime Minister Modi, in his speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, spoke of the Indo-Pacific vision. And there was one particular point which is very relevant to European audiences. He said that when he meant an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, it not only included the countries within this geography, but countries outside the geography which had stakes in the region. And I believe in particular, he was singling out the European Union. Now, let me be clear about a couple of things at the outset about our expectations. First, we don't expect, India that is, doesn't expect the European Union to choose sides between United States and China, between India and China, and so on. Second, we don't expect the participation to be primarily security driven. So what do we expect from Europe? First and foremost, we expect a significant step up in political engagement. If you look at visits of heads of state and government from Europe, you will find that aside from China, and perhaps in some cases India, there is an appalling lack of serious political engagement with the region. So we expect this to be stepped up. Secondly, we expect to focus as much on the Indian Ocean as on the Pacific. Now, if you read the latest issue of the Foreign Affairs, there's an argument that the United States' interest is in the Western Pacific and it should leave the Indian Ocean alone. To my mind, Europe doesn't have this luxury. Your energy comes from there, your goods transit through there, and therefore, whatever happens in the Indian Ocean is Europe's business. So let me suggest a few things which, at least as India, we would expect from Europe. Firstly, we'd expected a step up in political engagement, particularly with the littoral and small states of the Indian Ocean, in areas which range from environmental degradation and climate change to training their coastal forces, their coast guards, for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, search and rescue, anti-piracy, sustainable fishing, and so on. Now, that's part of Europe's core program as well. So I don't see a difficulty in doing that. Secondly, Europe needs to get more involved in the region's security and political mechanisms. The ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Pacific Islands Forum, and so on. A greater understanding needs to be forged by the European Union as a group, not just by France or Germany, which are active, or the United Kingdom, which till recently was a member of the European Union. Thirdly, the Europeans have already said they don't want to have unilateral dependencies. Therefore, resilient supply chains are important. And at least in India, we believe the Europeans must invest strategically. Now, I'm not saying India is an easy place to invest. Maybe China is easier. But Europe must look at the long term, must look at the demographics, must look at the demand, and must take the risk to invest in countries other than China so that they diversify the supply chain. Fourthly, I think there's a common view on multipolarity. India and the European Union need to have a multipolar world. It doesn't suit us to have a unipolar or a bipolar situation in the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, India believes that the initiative taken by France and Germany on the Alliance for Multilateralism must be stepped up. And it must convince democracies in the Indo-Pacific, the smaller countries, the countries which believe that they are otherwise being forced to choose sides between the two major powers, to tell them that there are alternatives among the middle powers, among the democracies, which will give them political and economic sustenance. So the Alliance for Multilateralism has to be stepped up. Lastly, digital connectivity. Now here, my Japanese colleague is going to present something on 5G. That's just the beginning of digital connectivity. Many countries in the Indo-Pacific are worried because we are going to slip into what we feel is techno-colonialism. Either we take the Chinese 5G model or we take the Western 5G model. We don't know which model to take. We don't know the costs involved. We don't know the technology involved. This is where Europe steps in and talks of digital connectivity with ethics, with reason. And I think that's important. Of course, at the end of it, the bigger countries also must invest in the security and defense space, but that's necessary for the European Union to do as a whole. So that, Frederic, is my short take on what we expect from Europe in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very precise and very realistic enumeration, which I'm sure will resonate in many capitals. It does resonate in a number of them in Europe already. I hope it will be extremely convincing for others as well. Let me turn to you, Professor Flake. I mean, in a way, your title is almost a political statement. You're CEO of the USAsia Center. So is there a place for Europe in the Indo-Pacific? And what are your expectations vis-à-vis the European strategies?
Well, thank you for that, Frederic. I'm honored to be on this panel with you, with Ambassador Gokhale, with my old friend Mihoko, Matsubara-san from Japan, and look forward to meeting Ambassador Vlahutin and others in the future. Look, I'm bringing my greetings from Western Australia, which it may surprise you is closer to Singapore than Sydney, closer to Jakarta than Canberra. We very much view ourselves as part of the Indo-Pacific region. We call Perth Australia's Indian Ocean capital and love the term kind of fulcrum point of the Indo-Pacific. You will quickly ascertain that there is more Arizona in my accent than Australia. I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. before defecting to the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, which is here in Perth, Australia. And if I'm honest, when I was in Washington a decade ago, I was quite dismissive of the Indo-Pacific construct. I thought it was too large. It had no use in policymaking. But where you stand depends on where you sit. And looking at the world from Western Australia, my view has changed dramatically, and you can understand why. Our broader narrative here is that if you want to understand the Indo-Pacific, you have to understand the shifting economic center of gravity in this region. When I began my professional career 35 years ago, nobody used the term Asia Pacific. We talked about the Orient or East Asia. The economic center of gravity was clearly in Korea and Japan and Northeast Asia. Over the last 30 years, as China has grown, that economic center of gravity has continued to shift southwest. And if we look forward and we think about the next 25 years, while China will still be big and powerful, I don't know anybody who seriously looks at demographics or resources that actually thinks that Chinese growth is going to be the story for the next 25 years. It will be the rise of ASEAN as a whole, of Vietnam and Indonesia, and of course of India. In other words, that economic center of gravity continues to shift southwest further and further and more deeply into the Indo-Pacific. And so that's just it. That's the reality. It's just like the Asia Pacific became a reality in the late 80s when Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia decided to integrate, and Australia and in New Zealand decided they wanted to be part of the region. That North-South integration created the Asia Pacific. At its core, the Indo-Pacific is fundamentally about how do we incorporate India into the Asia Pacific. And the reasons for wanting to do that are multitude. Secondly, I think when you look at Europe's approach to this, France may have a slightly different interpretation of what the boundaries of the Indo-Pacific are, just like Japan and India do, just like Australia does or the US does. I don't think we really have to worry about that too much. After 30 years, there is no membership in the Asia Pacific. There's no specific parameters or boundaries of the Asia Pacific. Really, if we just focus on that core diagonal, what Abe back in 2007 called the confluence of the two great seas, when he gave that wonderful speech in Delhi, I think you get an understanding of the region and why it's so important. Let me take just 2 seconds to talk about Australia's view, and then I'll talk about Europe's role and give you an Australian perspective, now that I'm an Australian citizen and have been here for 8 years, on the increasing European interest and role in this region. Look, success has many fathers. For Indians can find speeches by admirals going back into the 1990s. The Japanese will refer to that wonderful speech by Prime Minister Abe. The first government official to use the term Indo-Pacific in a planning document was the 2013 Defense White Paper. Then Defense Minister Stephen Smith, who happens to be from Western Australia, so has a very Indo-Pacific perspective, put it in. In 2016, it was also in our foreign policy, another Defense White Paper. And then in 2017, another West Australian political leader, then Foreign Minister Julie, used the Indo-Pacific as the organizing construct for a foreign policy white paper. So really, Australia as a country has fundamentally adopted and enthusiastically adopted the Indo-Pacific, and you can understand why. That kind of puts Australia in the center, as opposed to the Asia Pacific at the bottom, out of sight, out of mind. And it also has the added benefit of being true. That is where the shifting economic center of gravity is going. And just as Ambassador Gokhale mentioned, if you look at resource trade, if you look at broader commercial trade, if you look at security issues, they are increasingly going to be contested in the Indian Ocean. And to draw some imaginary line through the very busy Straits of Malacca and say they're different regions kind of misses the point of the world that we live in, especially given the fact that the West Australia coastline is fully in the Indian Ocean, and yet so much of our energy exports and commerce goes up through the Pacific. And so it's key to where we are. Australia, as a country, welcomes European involvement in the Indo-Pacific. I would hearken you back to 2017. Then Minister of Finance and Senator from Western Australia, Matthias Cormann, managed to convince the German Business Council to host their annual Asia Pacific Conference in Perth, convincing that we're part of Asia, you should be here. And that was just the beginning of a sense that we wanted, in an era of uncertainty about China's rise, uncertainty about America's role in the region, the more like-minded partners we had, the better. So a French Indo-Pacific strategy is perceived to be a very welcome development. A British Indo-Pacific strategy, a German or Dutch or broader European Union Indo-Pacific strategy is widely seen to be a positive development. And the reason is because of another kind of mantra that is at the core of the Australian psyche, and this is this framing of a rules-based order. Australia is a large continent, but with a very small population of only 25 million people in a region of very large powers. And so you can understand why Australians are very hesitant to live in a world where might makes right. Instead, we'd rather live in a world that is under the rule of law or a rules-based order. And you look at the concept of the Indo-Pacific, it means that we don't want a bipolar world. We don't want a G2. We don't want contest. What we want is more, engaged, like-minded countries in the region. And the final point I'll make on this before I wrap up my views is many of my colleagues back in Washington, D.C., in recent days, looking at the potential of both French and UK and other naval exercises in the region, have been voicing their view that, hey, while we welcome an Indo-Pacific perspective out of Europe, we would prefer that Europe just take care of things in Europe. That you take care of your own backyard, and that will free up American resources to contest with China in the Indo-Pacific. From my view, that is completely misguided thinking. And I think I probably would reflect an Australian view on that point, because the reality is if you're looking to pursue a rules-based order in this region, the more responsible stakeholders we have in the region, the better. The more China is unable to pitch every issue as a contest between the US and China. It's really about India's interests, India's look east and act east policy. It's about Vietnam's interests. It's about Indonesia's interests. It's about Germans and French and British interests. And so that complicates decision-making, both in security and in trade. It strengthens the web of international institutions, standards, and norms that we hope will make an increasingly interlinked Indo-Pacific in which Europe has a very important role to play. So I'll wrap up there. I've got plenty more to add later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Flake. You'll tell us in more details, perhaps later on in the discussion, what you actually expect the responsible stakeholder to do in the Indo-Pacific and where your specific expectations are. Let's now turn to Mrs. Matsubara. You are, Mrs. Matsubara, an expert in cyber, and you have heard the expectation expressed by Ambassador Gokhale, and I'd like to know precisely what are your expectations in this field, perhaps? You can speak, of course, of the larger issue, but what are your expectations on the cyber issue from Europe in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about 5G in the Indo-Pacific region, because as you can see, during this pandemic, we are growingly dependent on communications, IT, and cybersecurity, because this webinar demonstrates how important communication is and the internet is to stay connected and collaborate on each other for 5G or Indo-Pacific collaborations. And 5G is very important for the better connection and the collaboration in the cybersecurity and IT. So 5G has several issues, and I'd like to share how Japan has been contributing to better 5G in terms of cross-vendor approach, academic industry collaboration, and also financial support for better 5G infrastructure. So 5G raised a lot of attention and problems these days, and one of them is vendor lock-in, because there are not so many vendors available to support 5G technologies. And it can strangle alternative options to choose facilitate fair market competition. So that is why it is so important to take a cross-vendor approach. And the internet has so many challenges these days because of the amount of internet traffic and data growth. So we have to start thinking about what is alternative for the internet. And it is crucial to improve computing power, reduce power consumptions for sustainable development, and also minimize latency and ensure stable communication so that we can stay connected. So that is why this new concept called Innovative Optical and Wireless Network, or ION, was developed 2 years ago. So this is innovative end-to-end communication infrastructure with full stack accelerating photonics and wireless networks. And this concept depended on several types of technologies, including information technologies, of course, but also AI and cybersecurity for better communications. And of course, no one single organization can develop this huge concept. So that is why the global collaboration and collaboration between academics and industry is so crucial. So in October 2019, NTT, my company, and also Intel and Sony announced this ION Global Forum and invited global academic institutions and industrial organizations to join this concept. And it is great to see that so many organizations around the world and the top tech companies, including Ericsson, for instance, from Europe, have already joined this forum. And another issue to develop competitive and also transparent 5G infrastructure is investment or cost. Because you do not want to see that investing so much in 5G or communications infrastructure in general, and you don't want to see yourself in excessive debt in return to invest in infrastructure. So that is why Japan, Australia, and the United States launched this concept called Blue Dot Network 2 years ago. And this is two commonly accepted principles to promote market-driven, transparent, and financially sustainable infrastructure development. And this infrastructure development includes, of course, transportation, but of course, communications and 5G or submarine cables in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's amazing that so many countries have already expressed their interest in joining this Blue Dot Network framework. And for instance, Chile already selected a Japan proposed route of a submarine cable because fiber optic cable is so important for communications per se, and including 5G communications to have the big mass of data transportation. And this will be the first route to connect Americas and also Asia Pacific regions. So this route and also Japanese technology will help the better connectivity between the American continent and the Indo-Pacific. And Blue Dot Network has already have another country to join the PAO in October 2020. And Japan and Australia and the United States were sure to announce that they will finance a $30 million US undersea fiber optical cable for PAO. And this project will link PAO and Singapore and also west coast of the United States. So this financial investment already attracted so much attention and already paved the way to have the better connectivity, including 5G in the future. So in a nutshell, to have a better connectivity and also 5G in the Indo-Pacific region, we have to have global collaboration from industry, but also from the government and also from industry and academia and the government. So we have to have a multi-vendor approach, and the Blue Dot Network are the great examples to achieve this way. And the ION Global Forum on the Japan-Chile undersea cable route and the PAO's involvement in the Blue Dot Network will also pave the way for better 5G connectivity. And I'm sure that the bigger role will be played by the industry in terms of this ION Global Forum, as more companies and non-academic institutions will join from not only from the Indo-Pacific region, but also from Europe. So to do that, interest not only from Asia or Indo-Pacific region, but also from Europe will be crucial, because to have a better connectivity and the free and open Indo-Pacific region cannot be achieved by a single nation or single organizations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Matsubara. I mean, that's quite a lot to chew. And before I turn to Ambassador Vlahutin, just to give her 1 second to bring all those expectations together and answer them, let me just remind everybody that you can start asking questions by just clicking down on the Q&A button and write down your question, and I will relay them to the guest later on. Ambassador Vlahutin, you have heard the representative of the countries within the Indo-Pacific. And a lot of what they expressed in terms of expectation relates precisely to your own activity. So how does Europe, first of all, how do you react to this? And how does Europe intend to frame itself the connectivity debate, especially in the digital era, which has been mentioned a number of times in those presentations?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and very good morning from Brussels. I hope that you both hear and see me and that connectivity is indeed good. I mean, already quite a lot was said by colleagues, and I'll try to wrap it up, but maybe let me start from talking about very briefly three reasons why this particular discussion is actually happening and is even possible. Because in the last decade, if you wish, the changes that have happened have sort of framed and enabled the discussion that we are having today. First, the enhanced interdependence that came with the digital technology. I think there is a growing understanding that the way we are interdependent is completely different in qualitative terms from what was before, and that importance of norms and standards became even bigger. The second is that the reasons to pivot and capacity to pivot between Indo-Pacific space and Europe have grown. It's not only about the off between US and China, and that nobody really wants to be a collateral victim of this, but also very important growing convergence on values. Asian democracies and European democracies see eye to eye much more on a number of fundamental values. And then third is the realities, the facts and figures, and the economic reality. For me, it's always really interesting to hear the request of more of Europe or a larger presence of Europe in that space. While when you look at the numbers, Europe is massively present. European Union, or all the member states of the European Union already is the largest trade partner with India, is the second largest partner to ASEAN, is the largest FDI provider in ASEAN. So Europe is already massively present in that space in terms of economic involvement. For Europe, of course, there are very many important elements in Indo-Pacific that provide great opportunities. Besides the things that I have mentioned, I mean, this is a home for 1/4 of the world population, which is very young, which is dynamic with a rising middle class and therefore also dynamic economic development. This is space that is critical for maritime trade and for freedom of navigation. And I think in European Union, there has been a realization, I'm sorry, of the need to really conceptualize all these changes. And therefore you see not only that some of the member states have already sort of tabled their strategies on Indo-Pacific, but the EU as a whole is working on its own strategy. But we have in a way started implementing it even before we conceptualized it. Also through the connectivity partnerships that we have negotiated with Japan, where many of the things that were mentioned today are reflected. And I'm in the middle of being a chief negotiator on the EU-India connectivity partnership that we hope we will be able to finish by the time of the summit in Perth. What European Union brings to this, I mean, some of the requests have already been mentioned, but I think when you look at the activities and our presence, the first importance is the political identity of the EU. EU is a collaborative power. And this is, it's predictable and stable, and I think very much sought after partner for all those who don't want to see bipolar world. European Union also brings, I would say, probably unique experience on interdependency. We are the result of connectivity. We know how to overcome difficulties also through regulatory solutions. And I think this knowledge is something that will be very much needed. We are, of course, very capable in terms of the financial and economic possibility to invest, and this is something which is very much needed. But also, of course, we are facing certain challenges that we need to discuss and overcome. There is still a lot of fragmentation. Just the fact that European Union is so massively present, but that is not visible in economic terms, is something that we need to address. We also need, and this is one thing I found through working on the connectivity partnerships, we really need some new instruments. We can't solve 21st century problems with 20th century tools. And it is of key importance that we look into the challenges that are in front of us and try to see what is this new generation of instruments that we need to address them. I think my colleagues on the panel have already identified the topics, and they are obvious. It's the climate change, it's digital connectivity, but with ethics, it's rule of law and rules-based order. But I think, so we know how, we know what we need to do, but we need also to sort of have very clear idea on how we do it. There is a need really to be concrete and visible. The strategic infrastructure has already been mentioned, and I think this is one of the issues where all of us have major stakes. We need to agree what do we want to do and how we want to move with the work on strategic infrastructure. Blue Dot Network was mentioned. I'm ambassador at large for connectivity in the European Union. There is the notion of quality infrastructure. There are other strategies that are connectivity strategies. So we have to find ways of being concrete at the level, at the scale that would really bring a transformation. So in terms of the political engagement, in terms of engagement in different security and political mechanisms in the Pacific space, and of course, support for multilateralism, I think Indo-Pacific has a very, very stable partner in European Union. I would stop there. There are very many things to discuss. I would rather than open the floor maybe for questions and comments so that we can zoom into different details of this better. Thank you.
Very much, Ambassador Vlahutin. I mean, clearly, we have had 4 very interesting presentations. I remember from yours that Europe is already present, but needs to be concrete and visible. And I think that's indeed a major challenge. That's how we will see the actual level of involvement in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, in the forthcoming months and years. Now, let me turn to the audience. And we already have a number of questions which directly deal with the question of China. First of all, there are some who ask, and this is a question to everybody, if China is and should be part of the Indo-Pacific construct. To you, Ambassador Vlahutin, there is a question of how EU is taking the US Indo-Pacific strategy that is somehow aimed at limiting China's influence in the region, as the Southeast Asian countries are not taking effective part in US Indo-Pacific strategy. What makes the EU different that this and the region it covers? And there are also questions about the Quad and the way the EU should relate to the Quad. So let's start with this, with a general question to all panelists. What is the role of China in all this? And there is, of course, all those notions about inclusivity and everybody being cautious, and so on and so forth. Clearly, the China question is at the core of the debate, one way or the other. And I'd like to have your direct take on it. Ambassador Gokhale, please.
Thank you, Frederic. Let me frame it in two terms. Firstly, China is too big economically, militarily, and every other way to exclude it from the Indo-Pacific. So the short answer is China must be a part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But the second point is it cannot have a veto on the Indo-Pacific concept. It cannot insist that consensus means denial by any one party kills the idea. So we have to work on the one hand to bringing China into the Indo-Pacific, and on the other hand, making it clear to them that they don't have a veto on the way that it works. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. Professor Gordon, how do you see things from Australia? I mean,
I very much agree with Ambassador Gokhale. Of course, China is central to the Indo-Pacific. You can't have an Indo-Pacific without China, but we should distinguish between the Indo-Pacific as a region and strategies for the Indo-Pacific. So Japan has articulated a strategy to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, one that Australia has enthusiastically agreed to, so has the United States. India has agreed to it as well, except for they call it free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, right? The same basic concepts, right? I have spent a lot of time making sure that there's a distinction between the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is the region. The Quad is a strategy or a particular grouping within that region. They're not the same thing. Now, having said that, going back to your question, Frederic, in terms of specific things that the EU could do, if you look at the Quad leaders statement just 2 weeks ago, on the 13th of March, we had less than 2 months into a new administration in Washington, the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister of Australia, and President of the US not only have a leaders meeting, the first time ever, but come up with a very, very expansive agenda focusing on vaccine production and distribution, on climate change, and on technology. And it wasn't about anti-China, it was about what they might do together. If you look at that, that is also a starting point for an agenda as to what expectations are from the EU. Because on every one of those fronts, the EU is a natural partner in a free and open Indo-Pacific, a natural partner of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. And I would add to that the wonderful issues that Mihoko raised in her presentation, obviously on cyber, on infrastructure, on investment. Those are all areas where EU is considered to be, an advocate for the rules-based order. So what does the region want from the EU? Obviously, the more military presence, the more freedom of navigation floats, the more articulation of core principles like freedom of navigation in the region and sea lanes of communication, the better, right? Germany will send its first ever ship visit to Perth, Western Australia, this coming October. That's perceived to be a good thing. And it may be symbolic, but it complicates things. It complicates calculations in the regions for major powers. And that's a good thing because it means it's more rules-based. And then going back to what Mihoko said, investment, infrastructure, cyber, all these areas are areas. And again, I think Ambassador Vlahutin articulated it very well. All those areas are areas where Europeans' roles would be welcome and hopefully enhanced.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Matsubara.
So I also agree with Ambassador Gokhale and Gordon because the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific region is not to exclude China from us, because we have to collaborate with China. We have to continue the dialogues with China because China is indispensable part of our global supply chain. And the great things about the free and open Indo-Pacific region concept is that if you agree with this concept and accept the principles, including democracy and order of law, then you can be part of the Indo-Pacific region. You don't have to be in Asia or in the physically located in the Indo-Pacific region. And because And we can collaborate on Indo-Pacific region issues with China if we talk about global concerns such as vaccinations and also cybersecurity. And this is the interlink issue between the vaccination and cybersecurity, because during this pandemic, unfortunately, we see the growing number of cyber attacks on hospitals and the medical services, and vaccinations becoming more important for every one of us. So, so I'm sure that in China and other countries, including European countries, will be very much interested in talking about the cyber threats and the growing attacks on hospitals by cyber attackers.
Well, there seems to be sort of a contradiction in all this, which is everybody wants to cooperate with China, but it's increasingly unclear whether China wants to cooperate with everybody else. Of course, I'm stretching the point a little bit, but that's a question which is becoming increasingly actual and relevant. Ambassador Vlahutin, what are your views on the role of China in all this?
I think my colleagues have already said it all, but let me try to sort of summarize in 2 sentences. First, what we want to do is not against anyone, it's for something. And that something is, number one, sustainability, be it environmental, social, economic. And second, it's about level playing field. Level playing field means nobody has a veto and everyone plays by the rules. I think that the way we are interdependent and interconnected is something that will actually, in the end, force everybody to look for solutions rather than anything else.
Thank you very much. There is a second sort of geopolitical question which is addressed to you, Ambassador Vlahutin, but which I'd like to extend very much to Ambassador Gokhale as well, which is related to Russia and the EU assessment of Russia's views on increasing Chinese activities in Central Asia, which lead me to extend the question to how do you see in your respective countries the role of Russia into this? I'm sure that, or I suspect, we will have different answers from this. Let's start with you, Ambassador Vlahutin.
Thanks a lot. And let me start from what we heard from Central Asian countries. So there is one constant request from that part of the world. Can you please come up with your alternative offer? So Central Asian countries, of course, are in the space which has strategic importance for a number of big powers. But when it comes to what I do, which is connectivity and strategic infrastructure, the offers on the table are rather limited. And this is where they have been very vocal in inviting European Union to come up with its offer, to come up with its package of different solutions for great needs when it comes to strategic infrastructure in that space.
Ambassador Gokhale?
Yeah, Frederic, you know, we are in a different position from the European Union in that we are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there's no two opinions in India that whether it is Central Asia or the Indo-Pacific, Russian participation is important. Our concern is at the moment that perhaps their long-standing difficulties with the United States are blinding them to the fact that the Russians are also a Pacific power, and that their presence in the Pacific in the long term and the Indo-Pacific in the long term it adds to the multipolarity. So to us in India, the real challenge is not whether Russia should be there, but how to persuade the Russians that it is in their interest to be cooperative.
Okay, I'd like to turn now to both Mr. Flake and Mrs. Matsubara. I mean, and I'd like you to look at the question from the angle, you, Mrs. Matsubara, as a digital question, and the special relationship, or not ambivalent, but at least quite balanced relationship that you try to entertain with Russia in your region, and to Professor Flake, How do you see that, perhaps from your American past a little? Because on the digital question, it's quite difficult, and from an American perspective, it's also difficult to look at Russia as very much part of the Indo-Pacific concept as you define it, especially given the recent evolution of Russia's relation with China. Let's start with you, Mrs. Matsubara.
Thank you. So again, in the global discussions and concerns over growing cyber attacks, China and Russia are always raised in those discussions. And so it's time, and I understand that the global dialogues with China or Russia on cybersecurity have been really challenging, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is impossible to collaborate with China or Russia on cybersecurity. Because if we can concentrate on a focus and narrow down our focus on cybersecurity discussions with China and Russia on everybody's issue, such as, again, cyber attacks on hospitals, then I am sure that any country, including Russia and China, will collaborate, because those are the big problems also in China and Russia. So I would propose that we should narrow down our dialogue's agenda on those issues like hospitals attacks.
Professor Flake?
Yeah, look, I'll go back to the very important distinction between geography and strategy. Russia just has a small geographic foothold in the Indo-Pacific, in the far northern Pacific. And as such, they are a member of APEC. They are a member of the East Asia Summit. I would note there in many respects, because India is in the East Asia Summit, which is the preeminent regional organization, they already are in the Indo-Pacific. It is a reality, a fait accompli. It would be much more so if India had stayed in the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, or if they were led into APEC, but those are obviously challenges to go ahead. What Russia is not part of is any collective effort to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Their actions on the cyber front, their actions on the interference in democratic elections in Europe, in the United States, and around the globe, even in Australia, are such that I don't think people would be looking to Australia in the same way they would be looking to the EU or Japan or Canada or South Korea as natural partners, just given their behavior in the international thing. So yes, they're part of the region. Are they part of a combined effort to secure a free, open, rules-based region? Probably not. They're probably more negative in terms of their impact.
Thank you very much. Time is running very quickly, but there is a very important question which is being raised about the role of the trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, of course, we have had recently the signing of the RCEP on the one side, the signing of the CPTPP on the other one, which has generated various expectations. Ambassador Gokhale, India is part of neither of them. Whereas Mrs. Matsubara, Japan is part of both of them, if I'm correct. How do you see the role of those trade agreements in shaping the Indo-Pacific? And that's a question I would like you, Ambassador Vlahutin, to address as well, because this is going to be, I believe, central in how Europe will shape his own attitudes toward the whole concept. So, Ambassador Gokhale, please. Please turn on your mic. You're off.
Frederic, I fully agree with Gordon that it was perhaps a strategic error on the part of India not to join RCEP. I think the door is still open. A number of countries are supporting us. I hope that we join. You can't have an Indo-Pacific strategy standing on one leg, on the security leg, without an economic leg. But that's just my view. My government's view is that at the moment, RCEP doesn't give it the comfort level that it should. Let's hope that countries like Japan and Australia, who are very favorable to India, prevail upon ASEAN to somewhat liberalize the terms.
Mrs. Matsubara?
So as Ambassador Gokhale just said, I totally agree that security and international trade, the two sides of the same coin, and TPP will play a really important role for the free and open in the Indo-Pacific region. And to achieve that, because all the data is now transported via the internet, so cybersecurity will play a bigger role for this region.
Thank you. Ambassador Vlahutin, and you will have the last word on this because we have to bring this session to a close. How does Europe see that question? I believe this is going to be important in the months to come in the negotiation for the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. How do you see things from Brussels?
I mean, absolutely. Trade agreements are one of the key tools that European Union has been employing for decades now. And it is something that is, as everybody else said, is a second leg on which we would stand. However, they are not, of course, easy to negotiate. And I think that it would be in everybody's interest to really put all the efforts in trying to come up with solutions and trade agreements that would not only, of course, solve that part of the relationship, but Ambassador mentioned a very nice phrase, to raise the comfort level for everyone to have more predictability and therefore, again, more trust in our mutual relationships. So in terms of trade agreements, I'm not an expert on those, but absolutely for European Union is one of the key tools with which we both pivot and collaborate, and we want to do much more in that space.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very sorry to say that although we have a lot of additional questions, in particular one which was about the likeliness of European countries to be united in the making up of this EU strategy. And I would have loved to ask you this question, Ambassador Vlahutin, but I'm afraid we don't have the time. And so we'll conclude for the time being on saying that, well, time will tell, which is, I understand, very satisfactory to everybody. But I would like to thank you very deeply, all our participants. Thank you for very enlightening remarks and very useful remarks on top of it, which is not the case in all conferences. And I hope we will start building up on it in our next activities. Janka, over to you. Thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Frederic, for what was an excellent start to our Indo-Pacific endeavor at ECFR. Thank you, Vijay, Gokhale, Gordon, Flake, Mihoko, Matsubara, Romana, Vlahutin, for a fantastic morning. And thank you, all of those more than 150 participants that we were in the meantime, for joining us and for staying with us. I hope you follow our activities in the future. So with this, it is 10:01. So for a German, this is the perfect, perfectly ending on the spot here. Very, very happy. Thank you to my ECFR colleagues, Tara Barma, Mathilde, and Manisha Reuter for having put all of this together. And I hope to see all of you very, very soon in moving this debate forward all across Europe and engaging with our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.